Hello again, and welcome to Highfinity. In this session, we're going to show you how to build a full-stack, low-code enterprise web app using WebMaker. We will use WebMaker's graphical design studio and server platform to build, deploy, and test a complete web app in the form of a Dividend Dashboard. This Dividend Dashboard will utilize SOAP services, REST services, enterprise databases, and a loosely coupled enterprise application architecture to present a stocks and shares dashboard, including charts. Along the way, we will illustrate the extensive range of WebMaker features designed to accelerate your projects, including application orchestration diagrams, asynchronous page layouts, data bindings, data formatting, data transformations, and client-server logic created using a low-code approach, and much, much more. I'm Abdul, and I'm joined again by Gerard today, who will take you through this WebMaker Masterclass. It's quite an epic session, and hopefully you'll stay with us till the end. As with all our videos, we include an index in the description below to enable you to navigate to the parts of most interest to you. So with that, I'll hand you over to Gerard.
Thanks, Abdul, and hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to look at building a more complicated application using the full WebMaker stack in terms of server processing, and we're going to look at talking to various data sources, databases, web services, REST services, and show how we can pull all that information together and present a useful application for our users. So to start off with, I'm just going to show you an example of what we're going to go through and build during this video, just so we have the context of what we're doing as we're going through the development steps. So the idea behind this example application is it might be useful for someone interested in stocks and shares investments and in particular the dividends that those shares are giving. Now this data is just test data that we're using to illustrate the concepts within WebMaker, but hopefully it's a semi-useful concept. So on the right hand side of our screen here we have a list of stocks. In this case it's stocks that have declared dividends that we may be interested in. We can then manage our list of active stocks, i.e. maybe shares that you own and you're tracking, and potentially ones that you might be interested in, so you can watch them at the bottom on the left here. And the theory being you can move your stocks between these lists, see how they're doing, track the performance, and then make decisions in terms of your investments. Now, as I said, this is only test data that we're using, but it's a good scenario to illustrate various concepts that WebMaker makes easy to do for us. So as I said, in terms of data sources, we're going to be talking about various different ways in which we can get information. So our lists of our active stocks and our watched stocks for our users are going to be coming from a local database. We are then going to use some SOAP-based web service calls to get our lists of our declared dividend stocks, which we can see on our right-hand side here. And then we're going to combine that with some information from some JSON-based REST services to populate all the information that we see in terms of current share prices, our history of our share prices, and all those other details. So we'll go through this in more detail, and we'll explain how this is all used as we go through the video and we start building our project. But hopefully it gives an idea of what we're aiming to do. So we'll dive in and get started. So in this case, because we're using we're going to be talking to databases that are installed locally, I've downloaded WebMaker. I'm running it on my local machine. Anyone with a WebMaker Studio Pro license has the option to download it and install it in their own environment. That just makes it easier to access databases that I've got locally rather than needing information to be available across the internet. So I've started up my studio, and as usual, I'm going to use the new project option here to get started. Pick the base template, and let's just give my project a name. We'll call it a Dividend Dashboard. So as the project's created and it opens up for my first page. In this base project that I've used, we have an example heading, menu bar, etc. here. It isn't quite what I want to do for this project, so I'm going to start off with just removing some of these settings, and we're just going to add in a heading field at the top there. Okay, and then we can see we have this skin grid, which is 3 rows. We use our grid mode to see this more clearly. And I think that 3 rows works fine for us. We've got a header, we've got our main content that's going to be in the middle, and then some footer information that we may want to use going forward. Okay, so in terms of our page content, this example template that I started with has given me some sort of example data fields and buttons, but we're going to just remove that for now so we can start clean with what we want. Now, in reality, I am going to stick with the grid layout. So from my palette, I can just drag a grid on here. But what we're going to do here is add some extra rows to give us the arrangement that we're after. So I can turn my grid mode, and I can easily use the plus buttons to add 2 more rows. So if you remember back to this view of exactly what we're trying to achieve, we can see we've got 3 tables of data. Each one has got a heading above it. So if we assume in this first cell I can have a heading, I can have some data below it in a table, another heading, data below it in a table on my left-hand column. Then on my right-hand side, we can put a heading in this cell, and then we want the table to fill the remaining space. So we can use the right-click options here and merge these cells to give us that layout. And now we can easily start adding content into them. So I can put some headings in. I'll stick with these section headings for now. And as we did for the page heading there, I can easily double click and just put some text in. This one to be watched. Okay, so the final thing I'm probably going to do now when talking about the overall layout of my main page here is to look at the height settings. So we can look at our grid layout here, and we can say we want the second row to fill the space that we have. This is when we're talking about our overall skin grid. So our second row is where our page content is. And we can also say in terms of the height of my overall grid in my skin, my overall page, we can say I want that to be the full height of my viewpoint. And then we can see our footer then gets pushed down to the bottom. And our middle section with this expand option here will then grow to fill the space based on the screen size that you have available. So at any point we can save our pages and we can preview it. Not a lot to see at the moment. So in this video with this project we're building, we're going to concentrate a lot on the server side, how we pull in different data, how we orchestrate that and sequence that information together. Now, in terms of using WebMaker to do this, we have what we call an application map diagram that we can bring up, and we can see how our page flows within our application. Now, this is visible at the bottom of our screen here. So you can see that we have a layout here, a navigation that we get by default. We have our entry point. We can do some preparation. These circles represent our controllers, which is our processing on the server before our pages, which are square blocks, are then shown. And it's giving us an example save operation, which we're probably not going to use for now. So I'm just going to delete that from my diagram. And we can easily change, for example, the names. If I just save my changes first. It's just warning me because I'm naming the page I have open, but that's fine. So let's call this my dashboard. Now you may find that you're using this diagram quite a lot when you're building more complete applications using server rules, etc. So one thing I'd just like to point out is if you want to, you can go into the preferences and you can make sure that that diagram is shown by default when you've got your page design tabs open rather than having to open it up each time. Another thing that you may wish to do is you can then shrink down the thumbnails as well so that you're not losing too much space for your page design. So we can make those changes, and then by default we'll have this sort of view when we open up. Obviously that's an individual preference, but I find that useful. Okay, so in terms of these three lists and these three tables of data, we're going to pull those in using some asynchronous calls. So we're not refreshing the whole page each time, we're just updating the relevant parts of our page. Now the easy way to do that in WebMaker is by using what we call partial pages. So if we look on our application diagram here on our palette that it gives us, we can add full pages, we can add controllers, and at the bottom here we can add partial pages. Now these represent bits of the page that are going to be pulled in asynchronously at relevant points as and when we need them. Now we have two types here, depending on whether the information that those partial pages display is going to be retrieved using some Java code, or whether you're going to use the XML-based rules in the rule server. Now, in this case, we're using the full WebMaker stack, so we're going to use the XML rules-based partial pages and controllers, so we can quickly build and create our application. So I can easily drag one of these onto my diagram and start building up the flow within my application. So if we're looking at maybe this right-hand side initially, and we'll say this partial page is going to show us my declared stocks. And then we can add actions, which are these lines on our diagram to say that the dashboard page, which is this page we're looking at here, is going to make use of my declared stocks partial page. And then we can give this action a name. So we can identify it easier. Now we can accept that warning just because this action is coming from the page I have open. So let's call this the get declared stocks action. And we can repeat this process for the three lists that we want to do. So I'm going to add 2 more partial pages. And again, let's give these more useful names. So one is my list of active stocks. And this one can be my list of watched. Okay, and you can see that as I'm adding these, they're appearing on the list up here as well. And as we did for the first one, we'll just link them up by dragging on some links. And I'll call these also get active stocks and get benefit of naming these actions is we'll see it in a minute when we come on to configuring loading in of these partial pages. It's easier to see which actions we're dealing with when we've got useful names on them, rather than having to pick like action 1, action 2, whatever. Okay, so I think we're finished with that, so let's just reload that in now. We've finished adding some actions for now. And one thing just to point out, we talked about these new pages or these partial pages appearing on our thumbnail strip as such here, that this white line is the indicator that these are partial pages, they're not complete pages. So they're going to be embedded within our overall page, in this case our dashboard page. And even if we had the full thumbnails visible, you see that we have this square marking here, and that's what that's indicating, that this is actually a partial page rather than a full page. Which ties in, as you can see, on our page squares for these here, we have the corner marker. Okay, so we've set up these partial pages. We know we've got actions, so we can call them and we can display them. Because they're partial pages and it's going to be loaded in asynchronously at some point in time, we have to define an event on our page to say when we want to load them in. So in this case, we want to load it in as soon as the page loads, and then we will refresh them at later points based on action. So if I add something to my watch list, then I'm going to refresh my watch list to show the new entry. So if we come back and we look at the page that we're dealing with, so this dashboard page, and we can use the events tab on the right hand side. So we can open up our page events and we can add an onload event. Now, because we're doing partial pages and we're using this AJAX call, we'll use an AJAX submission event. And you can see that it's giving us the options of the actions that we want to use. So this is where having the names for those actions is useful. So for example, we can say our get declared stocks. So then the next thing we can configure is which data we're sending to load this in. So for now, we'll just leave that as submitting all the data. And then we have an option of where do we want it to go? Where do we want the partial page to be rendered on our page? So if we have a look on our palette on the left-hand side and we open up the container section, we have an entry here for a partial page container. So we use those to contain our partial pages when they get loaded in. So we drag these partial page containers onto our page in the relevant positions that we want our partial page content to be shown. So for this case, we want one of these in each of these empty cells. So we can just drag those in very easily. And so when we go back to our events here, and in terms of the target groups, we can see there our partial page containers, and we can pick the relevant ones. So we can see here that one's our group 2. We could rename those if we want to. So that's all we need to do to say on load. We're going to load the declared stocks partial page. So that's this one here. And we're going to put it in this location. And now we can add events for the others as well. But one thing, thinking about what we're going to need in the future as we carry on building this application, as we said earlier, we're going to want to refresh these partial pages, these tables of data at various points. So we could just do that and put an event definition in like this each time we need to do that. But what might be useful is to create a function that does these refreshes, so we can just easily say at a later point, okay, refresh my declared stocks, refresh my active stocks, without having to repeat some of the event setup. So within WebMaker, we can easily create functions from our events. So you see this link here. And I will say, actually, this is going to be my refresh stocks function. So you can see there that now the event where it was doing the AJAX submission, loading the partial page, we've now just got an entry that says call function. And under our page functions down here, it's given us that an entry that refresh declared stocks that we just created, and it's moved our content that we already had into there. So what we can do is we can actually add functions for all three of these. So we can load in our active stocks, which is the first one, like that. Let's call that function active stocks, and we'll add a third one, which is going to be to get the watch stocks. That goes into my third partial page container, and I can just give that a name. And so going forward, if we want to make any changes into how we refresh these lists, maybe we need to put up some help messages as they're loading in, or maybe we want to do some checking on what gets loaded, we can always extend these functions later, and then everywhere we use them, we'll pick up those changes. So the final thing I want to do here is on my onload event, I've added this function call for our refresh declared stocks. We just want to add 2 more, and we can use the call function, and this lets us call functions in external script files, but it also lets us call our page functions very easily. Okay, so we've now set up our page, we've set up the structure of our partial pages, and we've triggered them to load in on load of our main page. So although we haven't got anything actually content on these partial pages yet, the structure is in place, so we can, if we want to, we can test our application and we can see what's happening. We can always use our play button up here to run a local test of the application we're building in WebMaker. That will publish it to the test server with the studio and show us what happens. So as usual, we have our start form button, and we can click it, and we end up with this pretty empty looking page. Now, I don't know if you saw in the video, but there was a slight flicker as some information loaded in, but the information loaded in was empty. Now, one tool that's very useful when you're building WebMaker applications is our debugger view. So I can open this up using the option on our toolbar here. Now, what this shows is it shows the flow of information through the server processing of your WebMaker application. So in this case, each of those partial page calls has made a call to our server, to our rules processing. Remember, we picked that they were WebMaker rules server-based partial pages to get all the information and then render that. So although those pages don't actually have any content yet, we can see in our dashboard that the calls have been made and that the flow is correct. So each of these in and out blocks represents a different call to the server from our page. And we can see, if we look at this one, it called our declared stocks processing. This one called our watch stocks processing. And at the bottom here, we have a call that went into our active stocks processing. And we can come in and we can get more details out of this debugger, and we will be doing that through the course of this video. But we can see straight away that the setup of our partial pages is correct. It's going in, it's getting information, and then rendering a page. It just so happens at the moment our page is all empty, so there isn't anything to see. Okay, so the first of the partial pages that we're going to look at putting some content onto is our list of declared stocks on the right-hand side. Now, I think, as I said briefly earlier, this list of all the stocks that have got dividends declared is going to be coming from a SOAP-based web service call. And this is just the information here. So the request is which market you're interested in. In this case, we're just going to be dealing with FTSE 100 stocks. And as I said, this is all test data anyway. It's not dealing with the live system. And here's the structure of the response we're going to get back. So we can see here they're going to get a whole set of stocks, each of which have got a whole set of properties, the names, the current share prices, the declaration dates for the dividends, etc. So because this is a SOAP-based web service, we have a WSDL file for it. We can use that to pull into WebMaker and easily set up the calls for it. So if I switch back to my studio, and we're going to look at these declared stocks. So I'm going to open the page design page for our declared stocks partial page. So generally we deal with partial pages in exactly the same way as normal pages in terms of layout and adding controls, etc. So the main difference being that we don't have the skin concept for our partial pages because they are going to be embedded into an existing page which has its own skin. So the skin tab here is disabled and we don't see skin information on our outline, etc. What we do have a note here to tell us that, and also gives us the information about which page or pages this partial page is going to be used by. So as I was saying, we're going to use this SOAP-based service call to get the information that we're going to display on this page. So on our left-hand side, we've used the palette a bit already today, and now we're going to look at the data source tab, which gives us a few different options. And this second one here, we can see is saying use a WSDL file to design the page. So I click that and it's asking me to pick my file. I haven't got any yet, so I can upload it either from a file or URL. So I pick the WSDL file, I can upload it. And in this case, it's saying all this file needs a schema, an XSD file, link that up and continue. So now I have my services file that I want to use. I can select the file and it's then parsing the information. It's giving me a list of what operations can I call, what can I do with it. Now in this case, we just have a single service, single operation, which is this list dividend stocks. And that's the one we want to use. So when I pick it, I get my response information and the request information. Now on this page, I want to render the response from this service call. So I can take the response and I can drag that on, and straight away it gives me a nice table structure of that information. So I can save those details. Now, one thing we saw when we were looking at this document here is the request is expecting to potentially take in a market value that it's going to use to get the details from it. Now, I want this information to be rendered when the declared stocks partial page is loaded in. So I want to submit that request information with that call to load in the declared stocks partial page. So if I switch back to this dashboard page, again, use the data sources tab, and I can pick my WSDL that I've already loaded in. Now, in this case, we need to look at this request message here. So when I come to load in my partial page, I need to submit some information from that request so that it's able to successfully make the service call. So as I drag that onto my page, it's giving me this pop-up here, and it's saying, well, because this is the request message, so I'm sending this information somewhere, which of the actions from my page does this information belong to? And we can see I've got my 3 actions that we've already set up. Now, in this case, this is the value that I need to get my declared stocks. So I'm not interested in the other 2, just that one action. So I can select that and hit OK. Now, in terms of the value of this field, for now, we're just going to hard code that to say we want the FTSE 100 because that's the market that we're dealing with this test data. And in reality, we're not actually that that interested in changing this value for this application. So what we can do is we can easily make that a hidden field. We have a hidden field control here, and we can merge that on top to hide that away. So you see it's disappeared there, but we can always bring it back by saying show me my hidden fields. So that means that the fields there, the value is going to be submitted, but I don't need to see it on screen. Okay, so I've saved my changes by pulling that in from that data source tab. WebMaker has been able to generate me all the rules that I need to make that service call and get some information back. So at this point, I can run my application again and see what happens. Okay, so great. We can see on the right-hand side of my page in my declared stocks section, I've now got a whole table of information presented to me. And we can switch back to our debugger and refresh that if we're interested to see what happened in terms of the data flows. So one thing that stands out now that's different on this debugger trace is we have this green sections here, and the green, as we can see up here, is our external calls. So now when it's come into our declared stocks, we've gone through and we've made a request to an external service and got some information back, and we can easily drop these down to see the actual XML message that was sent. So in this case, we know it was a SOAP request, a SOAP web service. We can see that market values come through, and we can see in the response data coming back. And then that information is being bound to the fields that we've added to our page to render that in a table. So by designing our pages from that data source, it does some of this mapping and this binding for us, and then we can always go through and adjust and change it as we need to. Okay, so in terms of the other two sections, so we've got active stocks, we've got watch stocks. They're going to be rendered based on our local database information initially. So again, if I switch back to this document here, we can see in our database, we're storing table with the active stocks. We've got the codes for them and some date information of when they were added to these tables. So this is going to be the initial source to render our table, and then we're going to enhance that table using extra information from some of the REST service calls later. So if we go back to our design, and we can say, let's start looking at active stocks. So let's open up our page for that. Now in this case, we can use data sources again, but rather than a WSDL file, in this case, we're going to pick a database data source. So we can see our third icon here is for a database. So click that. We don't actually have any databases yet set up in our project. That's fine. We're just getting started. So we can set one up now. So we can give that a name. So in this case, I'm using a MySQL-based database, and I can adjust my connection URL because the database is called Dividend. Fill in the relevant details, and then I can test, and it's like, yeah, it's been able to successfully connect to that database. So that all looks good. I'm going to create that connection. Okay, so I've got my database in my list here. I can select it, and we're back now on our data source tab, and it's giving me a drop down here of which table are we interested in. So in this case, I said we're on our active stocks. We can see up here. So the main table that's rendering the basis for this page is this portfolio active stock table, which you can see is what we talked about here, portfolio active stock. So now I've picked my table. It says, how do I want to use that information? And if I drop this down, we can see we have 4 options: list records, or display a single record. Perhaps we're editing multiple records, or we're editing a single record. Now, in this case, we just want a table of information. It's display information. So we use the list records option. And then we get a structure based on what's in that database table. So it's connected to the database, it's part of the information for us. And like we did with our declared stocks page when we were looking at the WSDL data source, we can just drag this information from our database data source and put it onto our page. And again, by default, it's giving us a table structure using that information. So we can save those changes and test our application again. So now we can see that we've got a table in our active stock section, and we're getting some information coming back from the database. So one interesting point here where we're going to need to fine tune some of this database access. If we look at our model here, we have customers that have one or more portfolios that then have active stocks and watch stocks. So we're only dealing with a portfolio. So we don't actually want to get everything from the database. We want to restrict it to ones that match this customer and this portfolio. So again, we can refresh the debugger. We now have two green sections. And if we look at the database call here, we can see that what it's given us for now is just a select of everything from that database table. So we can go in and we can customize and tune these SQL operations to make sure we're getting the behavior that we need. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to our dashboard page, and we're going to add a couple of hidden fields to be tracking the ID of the customer we're dealing with and the ID of the portfolio that we're dealing with. So we can add some fields, and let's ID and ID. Now, for now, we're just going to default both of these to be the first one. Going forward, you would build probably initial screens in front of this one, in front of our dashboard, to say customer login, select which portfolio you're dealing with, etc. But for now, we're not interested in that section of the application. So we will set those values to just have a default of 1. Okay, so in terms of configuring the SQL statement that's been performed, we can see with our partial pages that they all have a controller component to them, because we have the circles here. So we can select the controller rules that go with our partial page. Now this brings up a new window which lists all the rules that happen. There's all the stuff that's going to happen on the server to get all the details we need to be able to render, in this case, a partial page, the active stocks partial page. So we can see here we've got 2 rules. Now the first one is retrieving information from the database, and the second one is just making sure that once we've got all that information, we render the active stocks partial page. So it's this first one here that's interesting and what we want to look at in some more detail. And if we drop it down, we can see we have a SQL statement action, and there we can see, like we saw in the debugger trace, that it's doing a selective of all the records from the database. So this is what WebMaker has generated for us. We said we want to use this database table. It's given us a starter here of say, okay, here you go, here's all the information. Now we want to just fine tune it a little bit to restrict it to just the portfolio we're dealing with based on the data model that we have for our database. So we can easily adjust this SQL string, and we can say we want to restrict the portfolio ID to a specific value. Now, the syntax in WebMaker to use dynamic values in our SQL is to put the dollar in front of them. Now you can obviously look in the documentation or whatever to get more details on this. But what we'll find is once we do that, we now have a parameter that we have to populate. Now the WebMaker rules controllers, whether that's for partial pages or full controllers, the rules-based ones are always working on dealing with XML information. So you'll find a lot of XPaths that you enter to say, get me information out of that XML data, or to make checks on the data, or adjust the data in various ways. And we can see on the left-hand side an example of the information that's coming into this controller. So at the start of my rules, these are the values that I have. And on the right-hand side here, it's showing me an example of the sort of structure we should be returning from this controller when it's finished, so that our page can correctly render the information. So in this case, for this SQL statement, I need to know where my portfolio value is coming from, the ID value. And we can see on here, it's at the bottom of my data, my form data, because we've added a hidden field that's going to be maintaining that value. So I can just drag that and populate that value. So if I then save my changes, and if we run through it again, and we'll go back to that debugger trace, and we can see, hopefully, that that value now is being populated into my SQL statement. So I'm still getting data back, so that's good. If I refresh my debugger trace, again, we're looking at the dividend database from the active stocks process. Yeah, and we can see the SQL statement now has a value in it, and for each of those parameters, each of the question marks in there, it tells me what values it's going to use. So my ID value of 1 has come through there. So that's all good. It's all working fine and doing what we want it to do. So we can now go through and do pretty much exactly the same steps for our watched list. So we can use a database data source, add some fields onto my watch stocks page, and then fine tune the SQL that it generated for us. So in this case, when I click the database, we can see we already have it, which is fine. We'll pick the watched stock database table, list records usage as before, drag that information across. And exactly as we did before, we will open the rules, the controller rules that generate the information needed for that partial page. We can see we have our SQL select statement, and we'll just make exactly the same change as we did before. And again, drag in my portfolio ID information. And if I test my application again now, hopefully we'll be getting information from all 3 tables. All 3 partial pages will be rendering me something interesting. So active information, we've got the dividend response still, and we've also got the watch stock information down here. So that is looking good. We can see 1 record coming in there. And like we've done before, we can refresh my debugger trace. And now we can see we have 3 green sections, 3 external calls out to information. Our watch stocks made a call to the watch stock database table, which is good. Active stocks, as we've seen, goes to the active stock table. And then declared stocks has made this SOAP call to the web service. So we're nicely bringing in the information from these different data sources, different locations, and presenting it on screen. Now, one thing that stands out to me straight away is the layout still isn't looking quite right of this page. We can see that the middle section is scrolling nicely. I'm not losing my header, I'm not losing my footer, but really I want each of these tables to scroll independently. So for example, when it first loads in here, I have no idea I've got a watch docs list because it's halfway down the page. So let's maybe spend a little bit of time and see if we can sort that out. Okay, so if we switch back to our main dashboard page, and we can look at configuring this layout. So we know overall our skin section looks okay because we're not losing our header, our footer staying at the bottom. So it's the page grid, which has got our sections in it, that we need to look at adjusting. So first of all, if we look at the sizing options for our grid and our grid layout, we can see we've got 4 rows, and at the moment each one is saying to fit the height to the content. Now what we actually want to say is that our heading rows are fixed, but these other rows, we want them to expand or contract based on the space available to us, based on whatever space we have on your page or whatever. So for our second row and our fourth row, we're just going to change those to say, actually, fill the space we've got rather than be fixed to our content. And then the other change we are going to make is we're going to say, in terms of our grid overall, so the size, the height for our overall grid, our default there is saying be as big as our content can be. Where actually we're going to say, let's use 100% of the space available to me. If we just test that, we've made a couple of changes there. Let's see what impact that has. Okay, so straight away, looking a lot better. I can see both of my tables, and this right-hand one that is longer is scrolling in place rather than going off the screen. So that's looking a lot better. So the next thing that stands out to me when I'm looking at this table here is, as soon as I'm scrolling, I'm kind of losing my headers, and I've also got some duplicate headings there. So can I do some stuff to start improving the look of this table? So we will switch back in this case to the declared stocks, because that's what this section is, this partial page, and have a look at the layout and the design of this partial page. So when we've dragged on the information from our data source, it's given us a basic table of that data, and it's outputting all of the columns and all of the information. If we want more control over how these tables and how this information is presented, we can use, in this case, we're going to use the paging table control that we have on our palette. So if we drag this on to our page, you can see it gives us a similar sort of structure. We've got a table and we've got a list of fields. And one thing that we can always do is we can turn on the highlighting of our layout containers, and we can see the groups which have the blue outline and our repeating information, which has got this reddy purpley color outline on it. So, and you can see that the structure between the two looks very similar in terms of that grouping. But what the paging table does is it gives us some additional options in terms of sorting, paging, and in this case it has the concept of sticky headers, which is what we're going to enable to get our headings to stay in place as I scroll my table. So in terms of moving the information into our paging table, we could use the data source and we could bind that into, merge that into my table, or I can just drag and reorder the fields between the two. So first of all, if I click my initial repeat that's come from the data source, and if I look at my page display bindings. These are the bindings going into the page. Now, the bindings is how we configure which bits of our data are going to be shown in which fields and which groups and repeats, etc. So because this is a repeating block, say we're going to have lots of these, we can see it's got the colored border. On our bindings, it's saying which is our repeating data location. So which is the bit of data that we're going to show multiple times. So for each match of this binding X path here, we're going to get a row in our table. And we can see that it's matching into the stocks as we'd expect. So what we can do is for the paging table that we've just dragged on, we can set that to use that same binding concept, same binding context, sorry, so that we'll get the same number of rows in this table as we did have in the one that was working. Okay. And then what we can do is we can just add the fields that we want to keep into our new table. So for example, the epic code and the name, we might want in there. The market, we're not going to show at the moment because we are only dealing with the FTSE 100, as we said earlier. So we won't bother adding that to our table. So then we can carry on through share price. I think we want to keep that, and we're going to keep declaration date. We won't bother with the share price date because that is the current share price. So it's today. It's going to be today's price. So we won't bother showing that. We'll add the declaration date for our dividends, and we'll add the ex-dividend date. And finally, we will show the dividend amount. So I've dragged those ones across into our table. Now, what we might want to do in terms of, for example, the dividend amount on our table, initially we had a separate field, separate column, showing the currency. Now we may want to just combine those into a single field. So on our dividend amount, selected it here, we can see the binding is just giving us that one value. So what we can do is we can adjust that binding and say, actually, let's combine the two and concat them together. So now this text box here, we can include any valid XPath. And if you need to read up on some of the functions or whatever, you can do here. There's some guidelines here. I think we have some links also in the tips here to various resources that can be useful for that. Okay, so there we're saying show the currency value and the amount in that one field. So we've hidden the share price date. These declaration date formats are kind of okay. So what we can then do is we can just delete this initial table because we've moved everything across into our new paging table. Save our changes so far. So one thing we also want to do is get rid of that label. So we'll just turn that off at the top. So in terms of configuring the sort of sticky headers concept, which is one of the reasons why we switched to our paging table control, we can always look in the documentation. Do a quick search here. And it tells us the sort of settings that we need to apply. So what we need to do is we need to click through onto this sort of table init field that we have for each paging table. And this gives us a whole load of properties that we can use. So in this case, we actually want to turn off the paging concept because we quite like the vertical scrolling. We just want to keep our headings in. As it says in here, to enable the sticky headers, we need to include the sticky headers widget. So we can see we've got a list of widgets. So the zebra one is giving us our alternate styling of our rows. So we'll keep that. And we can just add that into the list. Now, by default, the sticky headers will get the headers to stick at the top of the page as you start scrolling down. Now, in our case, because we've set up these each partial page, it's got this table. We want their tables to scroll independently in their own regions. The table is never going to get up to the top of the page. So we have to just add an additional setting to say where we want the headers to get stuck to. Now, in this case, if we look back to our main dashboard here, it is each individual cell of our page grid that is providing the container for the information. So in this case, we want the table to get stuck to this here grid cell 4. We can see the name there. So what we can do is we can just add an additional setting. Okay, so the options for our widget, so our sticky headers, we're saying we want to attach it to grid cell 4. And the final change we probably want to make for this to work nicely is on that cell, we can just say that we want to be able to position things relative to me. So that allows the headers within this cell to be positioned relative to itself so that we're able to easily stick our headers to the top of the cell. Okay, so that looks good. We've lost the duplicate heading in. We can see as I scroll that table, our headings are staying in place. And we can also see some other changes, so like the fact we've combined those values there with the currency and the amount. And one other thing we get for free by adding on the that paging table control is we can now sort based on columns, etc. So maybe which ones are going to be paying out the dividends the soonest. Okay, so what we want to do now is make the same changes to these two tables. So we've all got that same capabilities. Okay, so we will just go and update the tables on the active stocks and the watch stocks partial pages to make those same changes. So as we did before, on the containers, we've got our paging table option. I can drag that on to get started. You can see that's going for each record, and we'll set the the paging table binding, repeat binding to be the same location. As we did before, we'll think about which fields we want to keep. I'm going to keep the epic. We will keep the date. For now, maybe let's just keep that price. We're not going to worry about the portfolio quantity. We won't worry about for now. We'll just assume we've got one of everything. And we can adjust that later. And again, the sold date we're not interested in at the moment. So we'll just add those 3 fields for now. Delete that one. As we did before, let's get rid of that label. And then the final thing in terms of this initialization. Headers. We don't want to page the results. We'll look at the paging options later. Now, previously it was grid cell 4 when we were dealing with the declared stocks. If we look here for the active stocks, it's this cell here we're interested in, grid cell 3, and we can put in that same position setting. And while I'm here, let's put it in as well. So then finally we'll go to our watch stocks page and do the same thing. As we did before, we'll keep the epic, we'll keep the date, we'll keep the price for now. And we'll remove the label. Okay, so we can see we've lost our headings. The sorting is now applying. We can't quite check the scrolling because there's not enough in the table, but hopefully that will be working. And as we add the capability to be able to add stocks to these tables, we'll be able to confirm that later. Okay, so now that we've got the layout of our overall page looking right and the table structures looking right, we're going to move on to expanding the information we're seeing in our active and watch stocks tables. So at the moment, we've just got the information coming from our database, which has basic settings. Really, we've got the name of the stock, when we added it to our list, and the price that it was at that point. Now, if we go back to have a look at what we're trying to build, we can see actually what we're showing is the current price. We're showing the change since we added it, changes since the dividends were declared, etc. So to get all that extra information, we're going to be using another service call. So if I switch back here, in this case, we're going to look at this get stock status service call that we have, which is a REST-based service, and that gives us back a JSON response. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the format here where we can give it multiple stock codes, and we're going to make a service call and say, get me the extra details for all of the stocks in our list, and then we're going to merge the information we get back with the information we got from our database and present it in a helpful way in this table. The first step we're going to do is set up the ability for us to call this service. Now, in this case, we've just got this information about the service. We don't have a WSDL file that we can use. So we need to do a couple of manual steps to set up our WebMaker application so that we can call this service. Now, if you were to try and use a data source, there is some information here of the steps that you need to go through, but we'll go through it in the video now and get it working. So the first thing we need to do is to create what we call a proxy node to sort of represent that remote service inside our application. So we're going to go to the advanced settings option here, and we can see we already have some of these proxy information for our WSDL services that we've been using, and those have been created for us automatically because we had the WSDL file and we imported it in through our data sources tab. So for this REST service, we will manually set up a similar concept. So we go through here, select the models tab, and we can give it a name. So in this case, So what this is going to represent is the sort of endpoint for that service within our application, so we can then configure it. So in the option here, we want to say this is actually a remote service proxy. Okay, so that's given us an entry. We can see it in our list now with the others. So in order to now configure the location of this service that this proxy is going to deal with, we can go into our test settings, because these location information may be different for our test environment to our publication environment. So for now, we're just dealing with configuring it in our test settings. So once we're in here, we can use the agent type section here, and we can find the entry that we've just created. Like we can see here, dividend rest proxy. And what we want to say is this is a proxy to a web service. Now in this case, it's not a SOAP service, it's just a standard HTTP call service. And we can enter in here the URL that we want to use. Now, as I said earlier, we're just using some example data and some test services. So I'm just going to type in the URL. And then what we need to make sure is that we tick the advanced features option. Because this is REST services, we're going to need to be either maybe changing the HTTP method like get or post or put or whatever, and also potentially configure the rest of the URL and maybe some header information, etc. And by ticking that box, it now allows us to do that, as we'll see shortly. So then that's all sorted. So in terms of where we're going to make use of this new service, if we go back and we have a look at our diagram that we've been creating, we've got two locations. We've got our active stocks list and we've got our watch stocks list. Now, in both of those cases, we're going to want to make use of this new service to get extra information to render those partial pages. So we could go through and we could duplicate our functionality in both places. But to avoid us having to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new controller, again using the XML rules, and we'll call this get stock status. And this is the one that's going to make the calls to our service. And just so we're aware we're going to be using it from these two pages, we'll add those links onto our diagram. So we can bring up our rules for this new controller we've created. It gives us the same view as we've seen already for our partial page controllers. Now here at the moment, we don't have any rules defined because this isn't linked to a page. It's not showing, it's not giving us anything automatically. So we're free to add whatever we need in here. So if we go back to documentation, and we find the section on REST services, we've set up our proxy now, we've configured the location. So we're into our rules. So we're going to need a rule that's going to call this service. And what we want to make sure is we're configuring it and we're sending it to the right URL that we need with the right parameters. So to do that, we need to insert this, we call this HTTP header fragment, which is going to be used to configure each request that we make. So I can copy that fragment here, and I can add a rule to insert it. In this case, we're just going to do insert action. Rather than file, we can just paste in that content. So for this particular service, we don't need to set a specific action header. So we will turn that off. And what we want to do is we want to use the base URL of the service that we've configured against our proxy node, and we want to append to the end for this particular service. If we go back to this document here, we know we want to be calling get stock status, and later on we'll look at this stock price history one. So we can say we want to append that part onto the end of the URL, and we want to do a get request. Okay, so moving on in terms of the parameters, we only have one, which is the stock that we want to call. And we don't need any other. Now, in terms of where we want to insert this, as we've been going along so far, we've seen how our data that's flowing through our rules processing through our server controllers is in XML format. And we can obviously put whatever we want into that document and build it up in many sections as needed. The other option we have for information that we are just sort of using temporarily, so in this case we're building this structure and then we're going to send it off to the service and then we don't need it again, we can look at creating what we call variables. So in this case I might say I might create something called status and say, instead of putting this fragment in my main document, or what we call our fact base with all my other information, I can keep it separate and put it into a status variable and then still use it in the exact same way, but it keeps that information separate, and we're not then going to be mixing up our data fragments. So now we've got our configuration info for our request service. We need to be populating this stock value, and then we need to be calling the service. So we can maybe add another rule to do that. So we want to assign the stock and so in here, to do that, we'll have two actions. Just saying our stock value, we're going to call service head. So we're going to use an assign action to set it, and then we're going to use an invoke service action to make the call. So in terms of our to location for our assign, this is what value we want to change. Then this is this stock value here. And what we know is we're putting that fragment into our status variable. So we will use that in our XPath location. Now, in terms of the value that we're setting, this is going to be some kind of information that's coming to us from the calling process, whether that's the active stocks processing, the watch stocks processing, or whatever. We're going to call this controller and say, here's my stock or stocks, get me the info for it. So we will expect that to be somewhere in our incoming data. So at this point, what it might be worth doing is, if we come back to our page, we're thinking, well, actually, going forward, we're going to have a few cases where we want to be able to identify stocks. Maybe when we want to move a stock from the watch list to the active list. Maybe we want to move a stock from our right-hand table into one of our lists on the left-hand side. So to let us do that, we're going to add another hidden field to our page, along with these other two that we've got, and we'll just give that a name, say selected stock. And then we can use that field for various different uses. And what we will do is we will use that to pass through this list of stocks that we want to retrieve from our get stock status. And if we look at bindings, we can see that this selected stock field is going to be within our form data fragment at that location. So we can use that as our value that we're going to assign into our configuration fragment for this service call. So the last thing we want to say is actually make the call. And we know that our request that we're just configuring is in our status variable. And we'll just put our whatever response we get back into that variable. And in terms of the service we want to call, we can pick the REST proxy that we've just created. So we can save those rules. So hopefully now we've got our controller here. So as long as we give it the right value, it's going to go away and call something. Now we're not sure exactly what we're going to get back yet, but we're going to make the call, and we can test and tune and adjust as we need to. So if we start looking at the active stocks controller first, so before we render the partial page, we want to get this extra information. So we're looking at the rules for that. So we were here earlier, and we know we've got our SQL call to get the information out of the database. And now what we want to do is we want to use the codes for all of these stocks in this database table that we've just retrieved and say, let me take them, let me get some more information using this new service call. So we're going to add some additional rules to here to let us do that. So like we were just doing, we can use add rule. And the first thing we're going to do is just in case we have some values in this select stock field, because I just said we're going to be using that for this process. So just in case there was any data in there, we're going to clear it out and make sure we're starting with a blank value. So we're just going to populate it then with the stocks that we want. Okay, so then we're going to get our database records. That's all fine. So now what we want to do is use that information and create a list of stock codes. So what we want to do here is we want to build up. So for every record that this returns, we want to pull out the value of it. So in terms of our rule condition, what we're looking for is for these records. And what we want to actually say is we want to do this for each of our active stocks we've returned. So we will enable this loop option here. So what that's saying is for everything that this XPath check here matches, which in our example is these 3 records, we're going to do the set of actions in this rule, which we're going to add in a second, and it will repeat them for every match. And all we're going to do actually is a single action to assign the value. So where we're going to, we've said, is our selected stock, and where we want to come from is the epic value. Now that's a relative XPath because we're in this looping context. But what we want to do is we want to make sure we don't lose the existing information, and we want to build up this list in a comma separated string. If you remember from here, if there's multiple stocks, it needs to be in that format, a comma separated list surrounded by square brackets. It's in a JSON array format. So we, instead of just taking the one value, we can concat it onto our existing one. So take our existing selecting stock, add the epic, and we'll make sure we put a comma in there as well. So then we're going to add one more rule now, and this one is going to get So we don't want to bother making service calls if we haven't got any stock, so we can have a check to say we have at least one stock. And we can easily just say, well, make sure we've got a record back from our database call. So the first thing we're going to do here is add those square brackets to our list of stocks that we've just built up. We saw that they're needed. So we do another assign. So we're saying this is add bracket. We're still dealing with our selected stock value. And in this case, we're doing a concat again, add the square bracket, add a square bracket at the end, keep the selected stock in the middle, and we're just stripping off the very last character because that will be a comma at the end that we don't want. So that's fine. And then the important bit is we're going to call our get stock status controller that we've just been dealing with. And what we will do is whatever we get back, we're going to keep it in the data alongside what other information we have. Okay, so what we're hoping now is going to happen is when we try and pull in this active stocks list, we're going to retrieve the information from the database. We're then going to loop through those records we've returned and pull out the stock codes for them all. We're going to send that list from here into our get stock status controller here, which is going to format that into a request to our REST service. Name in there. Okay, so now we can use our run test option like we've done before to try it out and see what happens. And we'll use our debugger screen to look at the logs, see which information we're getting back, and see what we need to fine tune to get that info on our screens. We've got our data coming back here as before. We can refresh our debugger trace. See, watch stocks isn't interesting, but here, active stocks is what we've been dealing with. So we can see straight away now that there's two external calls happened. So one is our database, as we had before. And what we can do with our debugger trace is we can say after we've retrieved information from the database, if we show you our processing details here, we can see that which rules, etc., have been fired and which conditions have passed and which actions have been invoked. So we can see it checked our create list of stocks. The condition passed, so then it fired the rule. And here we have two entries for our create stock list action, because in this case we had two stocks. We can look here, we've got two stocks in our database table. So we know that that's a repeating, looping rule. So the actions are going to fire twice. So that's why we have two of these. We can see after the first one, our selected stock value there had one value in it. And after the second time that action fired, we can see we now have two values in it. So as we expect, we've built up that list. So then it went on to the next rule. We had at least one stock. Yes, so that condition passed. We fired the rule. We added our brackets. We talked about that. So now we've got the correct value in our selected stock string. And then we've gone into the get stock status controller. And in the same way, we can open up, to see the details of what happened, what rules fired in that controller. And the interesting point here is we can see after the insert header fragment action happened, we get 2 logs, one for our main fact base of data, which is this eForm structure we've been dealing with, but we also get a log for our status variable to show us that fragment that we inserted. And then we can see that we set the stock value in there. See that changed, and then we've made a call. And if we look at the response we got back, we can see here's information about what URL we were going to call. Here's the response information we've got. And because we've turned on, remember earlier we ticked the box to say, I want all the advanced features. In our response, we get information about the headers that were in the response from the call, etc. And in our body, we get the content. And in this case, it's telling us that it actually wasn't XML response, which is what we're expecting because we know this is a JSON-based REST service. So instead, we can see here, there's our JSON string with some data. So that's good. We've called the service and we've got some data back. And that's available to us. So what we need to look at now is how do we make that information, format the information in a way we can use it to bind our pages. So the first thing we need to do is we need to convert that into an XML format. Because as we've seen already, WebMaker deals with XML formatted data in terms of bindings, in terms of our server rules, etc. So what we can do is we can add some rules into our get stock status controller to format this information in a way that we can more easily interpret. So from our rules here, we can use these links of from our logs here, we can use these view rules links here to take that information into our rules view, and so we can help with configuring our bindings, etc. So in this case, I clicked on the status variable and it's showing me the content of that variable before and after this particular action was fired. So this was the information we had. We fired this action, and this is what we then had in it. So what we want to do is add another rule to say, let's process that JSON response into a format that we can deal with. So first of all, we want to say, did we have some content? And it wasn't blank. So we'll just add a check there to say, check that we have some data to process. And in terms of the action that we want to perform, in this case, we are going to use the Java method option. And this lets us call out to any Java method, static Java method that we want to use to manipulate the data. Now we provide some utility functions that we can use here to convert between JSON, XML, and vice versa. So in this case, we want to use this JSON to XML. Now, in terms of the 2 locations, where do we want to put the result? So we're going from JSON to XML. So this is going to be our XML data. Yeah, so we're going to keep the data within our response structure in this status location for now, so we can see what we get. And in terms of our JSON string, we know this is in our non-XML content. So we just have to remember as well that we are dealing with the status variable that's going to contain this SOAP envelope structure for our service call. So when we're checking against this data, we just need to include that status prefix, what we've put here, so we know what where to look really for these exports. So now we can save our changes and do a test again to see what happens. Hopefully we'll now see that data being converted into an XML format. Refresh our debugger. Find here where we called that get stock status. We can see now this process JSON response rule has been fired. And if we look at the data afterwards, so we had our non-XML content. But now we can see actually we've got some nice formatted data that we can use. So then really the final thing we want to do in this get stock status controller is make sure that we're returning this structured stocks information. So after we've processed the response, let's add a rule to say move the info to return. So let's make sure we have information. At the moment, this is still in our status variable, so we've got to say check have. And as long as we do, we're going to move it. So we'll move our top level stocks element, and we're going to move it to the root of our main database and replace whatever content we had coming in. Now, by default, when the set of rules in our controller finished processing, the information gets returned to the calling location, which in this case is our active stocks controller, is configured under the rule-based settings here. So by that being the /, which is the default option, means whatever is in the root of our main fact base, our main document, is what gets returned. So we replace all of that information with the stocks fragment. And then just for completeness, we'll add one more rule to say if we couldn't do that for whatever reason, the service call failed, whatever, we didn't end up with our list of stocks, then we'll just return an error message instead. So if we don't have a stocks element to return, then we will just insert replace whatever we do have at that point with that error message. Okay, so again, let's run it and let's see, we should be able to see that stock information now flowing all the way through. Here we go. And now if we look at what comes out of our get stock status call, it is this nice list of stock information. And if we follow that through and we look at the information that's available for our bindings, we now have, which is our page bindings, in this case for our active stocks partial page, the information we can use to render that page. We have our database information, and then we have the extra stock information. So we're now into saying, okay, I've got information there. How do I use that to render my screen? Okay, so to help us with those bindings, we can take the useful information from our log here with some actual data, and we can use that, replace our bindings document that we've been using already with some more accurate information to help us complete our bindings. So we can see now, we see that updated information. So, for example, on our table, what we might want to do, or what we do want to do, is show the current share price as a field on this table. So I can add an output field onto it. Yeah. We can say that this might be current share price. So now we need to configure the binding so that this is picking up the right value. So we can see that our share price is coming in here. But how do we know which is the right one to use? What we can see, if we look at the guidelines here, is that we have this variable available to use in our XPath that will tell us that will sort of point to which entry in our repeating structure here we're currently looking at. So what we can then do is restrict the stock that matches to one where the epic of that stock equals the epic that we're currently dealing with. So if we were to save that and run it again, we can see that that's kind of working. So for HSBA 44288, which is the right value, and then Pru down here 152101. So that works, and that gives us a way of matching the data in our bindings. Now, the other option we've got is if we didn't want to have to do slightly more complicated XPaths in our page bindings, is we can merge that information using some rules in our controller. If we were to use our debugger again, and let's see what information is available in our active stocks controller just before we return to the page. So before we enter the page, what information have we got? So this is after we've made this service call. So if we update our rules, and we can see, like we were just looking at, we've got these two chunks of information. So what we could do is we could add some rules to merge this information. Now, there's a few ways we could do it. We could do sets of rules, lots of assigns, some copies of information or whatever, or the most flexible option, which we have in terms of manipulating data in our server rules, is to use an Excel transform. So what we'll do is we'll show how we can do that to merge these two sets of data. So we're going to create a rule, and we're going to say we're going to merge the data sets. And if we need to, for any point for our rules, we can add some extra notes here. So we could say this uses and one thing you'll note is that icon changes to tell you whether there are notes there. So it's easy to see if there's extra information to look at. So we only want to merge this if we've managed to retrieve some stock information. So as before, we'll just put a check in here. We have some data. And to do a transform, we use our transform action. So we're going to merge information that's within our data section. So we will say, let's use all of that as a source for our transform. And what we're going to do is we're going to end up with a fragment like this with the extra information in it. So we're going to replace what we have there with the merged resulting data set. So we can assume that that's going to work. Okay, so at the end of it, we will do some cleanup to remove the stocks information, because we know here we've merged both sets into one. So in order to do that merge, we need to create our transform file. So we're going to create a new XSL. And we can just type in our content. Now, obviously, there's lots of resources online to detail how to write Excel style sheets, etc. So I'm just going to paste some information in here. This is a relatively simple transform that's going to work for either active stock or watch stock, because we're going to use it in both of these cases. And it's basically going for each record, keep the values from the database, and find any from the REST call response that weren't in our database information, and copy those across. So we can save those changes. select that file here and save our rule changes. So interestingly, we can see that that binding has no longer worked because we've done our cleanup and we've removed that stocks fragment now before it gets to the page. But if we check in our debugger, let's see what information we did have. Yeah, and we can see now for each of our records, we've got a lot more information all in an easy format. So if I again go back and update my bindings, let's completely replace the data I have now with my updated information. And we could easily now, this share price binding becomes a lot simpler, like so. And as I was saying earlier, we can test some of these things in our preview without having to do a full test, because now our previews use whichever data we have here, because we can obviously edit this document. This page display bindings document that we see on the right here is purely a helper for when you're designing your pages and configuring your bindings and previewing. So we can edit that, but now we've updated it with an example of our live data. We can use the preview option to quickly see what these pages are going to look like, and we can see that binding is coming through. So there we've been looking at this active stocks, and in terms of our data flow, we're happy now that we're getting the information from the database. We're finding out what stocks we had there. We're calling our status to get extra information, and then we're returning it, merging that content. So our page has all the information we need available. What we want to do for our watch stocks process is exactly the same. So what we can do is we can put the same rules into our watch stocks controller as we've put into our active stocks controller. And we're reusing that same get stock status processing. So in our rules here, we can compare watch stocks with what we have for active stocks. Shrink some of these down. And we can easily see the changes we need to make. And what we can do is we can just copy those rules across and make sure they're okay. Control V here to paste them in. Okay, now actually all the ordering slightly off because it pastes it where I was at that point. So let's just move that one back up. Yeah. Okay. So we'll just look through these rules that we've pasted in. Is it correct? All our bindings, all our XPaths seem right. So one thing we know here is actually here we want to be dealing with the watch stocks rather than active stocks. This information's okay. Again, here, watch stock and active. So database, we want to use that same file, and we want to replace. Okay. So let's test that out. So here we go, watch stocks. We've called our service, single stock in this case. Yeah, so we can see in our data that's coming back to render our page, we have that merged information as we expected. And we can take that and use that to configure our bindings on our watch stocks page, partial page, in the same way as we were looking at with our active stocks. So now that we have all the information coming back to our page, we have all our merged data, we can look at adding the fields and configuring the display of these watch stocks and active stocks tables so that we have the percentage change information, we have the highlighting, etc., as we've seen when we were looking at this page earlier on. So if we take our active stocks page initially, we can see at the moment we're showing our code here, the date that we added it to our active list. We've got the current share price. That's probably the next thing we want to show. And now we want to show some of these percentages to show the change in the share price from the point we added it, from the point the dividend was declared for the stock, and from the point the dividend was actually paid out. And the actual price of when it was added, we're not going to show directly. So instead, let's say this is the deviation since it was active. And we can change our heading here. Then, as we say, we want some further deviation fields. So if I just copy some of those, and we want to say deviation since declaration. And we can add deviation and some of the other fields that we're going to add between there. We're going to show the dividend amount. And finally, what we'll say is the date. Name these fields accordingly. Now, in terms of this PP prefix that you'll see here, is when you add fields to a partial page, they'll be given a prefix like that to make sure the names are unique and aren't going to conflict with any fields that you may add on other partial pages or main pages. Because, for example, if you had a field called epic, which we're going to have on multiple of these tables, if we didn't have this prefix, you would get fields with the same name, so you might get some problems arising from that conflict. But obviously, if you knew that the field was never gonna conflict, you are free to name these without the prefix if you so wish. But by default, it will give you that there to remove those issues. Okay, so now we've got the fields we want on here. We can start looking at the bindings for them to make sure they're displaying the right information. So if we start with this deviation since active, what we want to show here is the percentage change in the share price that is now compared to when we added it to our active list. So we know the price when we added it is this price at active value that was highlighted here. We know we have the current share price, it's down here. So we can just do a calculation to get that value. So what we actually want is our share price minus the price at active. And we want to divide that by now. We need to now format that number as a percentage so we get a useful visual number. So we can use the format number And in this case, we want to say the format to one decimal place as a percentage. Now, I guess in this case, the difference between these two numbers is quite low, but depending on what that actually was and how the data changes, we will probably get values other than 0 coming out as that. And as we did earlier, we can look at our preview and we can see for the second stock that we're actually getting a bigger percentage or negative percentage there. To highlight those negative percentages compared to positive changes, we can use some styling, green or red, to make those stand out easier. So if we go back to our General tab and we go into our More options, we can look at our Control Styling section. So we can add classes directly, but what we want to do here is do some conditional styling. So we can use the conditional control styling options. Now in our themes, there are some highlight text classes by default, so we can make use of those. Maybe these names don't quite match our scenarios, but we can pick the one that fits closest. Alternatively, we can use our own theming, create our own classes. Depends on our requirements. So in this case, we can use overdue if it's negative, because that's a bad thing. It's going to have a red type style, depending on the theme, obviously. And then we can use completed for the good scenario when we've got a gain, we want to show it green. So by adding this conditional styling options here, if we now switch back to our bindings tab, you can see that we have 2 extra fields to fill in. So this is now the conditions against which these styles are applied. So our overdue, so our bad scenario, is when our current share price is less than we paid for it. And our good scenario is when the share price is greater than. And we can see in our preview that that styling is applying. So then we can go through and we can do the same thing for the deviation since declaration and deviation since ex-dividend, etc. So we'll just go through now and fill those values in. So for this case, rather than price at active, we've got a value here, price at declaration. And we'll do the same thing with our conditional styling. In terms of dividend amount, that's a simple binding. Yeah. Dividend date, likewise. And then finally, we've got another deviation field, so we want to add our conditional styling. Rather than price at declaration, we can see here we've got price at ex-dividend. Okay, preview that. Okay, so we're getting percentages coming through. So we've got an interesting situation here, though, in that this second row, we're not getting a valid value because the ex-dividend date hasn't happened yet in this case, so there isn't a price. We don't know what the price is going to be yet, so we can't show that value. So in this case, we want to look at some conditional display settings to only show the values in this last column if we actually have one. So if we go back to our general tab here, you can see how the visibility options, we have the choice here to conditionally hide or show this field. So what we want to do is we want to hide it if we don't have a value to show. So rather than being based on the fields we are displaying, we can actually say hide it based on a dynamic condition, which then applies in our binding section. And what we say is we're dealing with the price at dividend. So if we don't have that, if there isn't one of those, then we need to hide this field. And we can see there that's sorted out that issue. So other things we're looking at here, this date field here, we probably don't need to show the time necessarily on here. We don't want that T, which is sort of part of our data formatting. So we can change the format of that date field very easily. General tab, we can see we have a section on value conversions. We know it's a date field, so we can say our data is coming through in the full format, but we're just going to show the date for now. So again, we can see that change. So one other thing that might be useful to look at is ways of showing sort of tooltips or extra information on hover. So for example, we're showing the codes here for the stocks rather than the name, just to save space. But it might be useful if we hover over that, it tells us what the name of that stock is. So if we come back, we're still looking at general properties for the control. We have a field tip box here we can use, and whatever text we type in here will be shown as a sort of tip against that field. So just wanted to test something out. There we go, you can see that comes through. But what we can also do is anything that would be valid on our bindings tab, we can use, as long as we put it inside curly brackets. So in this case, we want to show the name value. So we use that format, and you can see that comes through. So now another option that we have for showing sort of tooltips or extra information against the fields is to use the server message type concept that we have here. So let's have a look at one of these deviation fields. So we're showing a percentage, and maybe we want to actually show what the monetary amount of that percentage maps to. So let's have a look at this deviation since it was active. And let's say we're going to have a server message, but it's not an error, it's extra information. So we're not going to use that error icon in this case. We'll use our hint icon. See that there? So we've got a more info. And then by turning on this server message, this will ask us for unbinding. So separate for the hint message, if we just wanted static text we wanted to output, we could have a hint message and we would just type it in here. In this case, we're using the server message capability because we want to use information from our bindings for this message. So you can see we've got a new field here to enter. And like we've done in other XPaths, we can use functions and whatever. So what we will do is we will concat some information. So we'll show the currency, we'll show the change by just doing that simple calculation, but formatting it so we don't end up with loads of decimal places. So again, if we have a look at our preview, you can see those icons are appearing now. And we've got that information coming through. Obviously, exactly what you put in here, how you style it, and whatever. There's options, and that can be changed as required. So it's looking good. We've got the right sort of information on the display we want here. We can now replicate these changes that we've made to our active page to our watched stocks page. So we're showing similar information on both tables. Okay, so we can switch back to our watch stocks. And like we've just been doing on the active ones, we'll add the fields in and configure them as we need to. And if we wanted to do something slightly different for the watch stocks, then we can adjust if we need to, etc. And we'll see later on we add a button here because we'll want a better way of moving it from watch to active, etc. So we've got our stock code, we've got the date that it was added to this list, and the rest of the fields we need to start adding in. Okay, so we've got our fields, and we can just go through and configure them like we've done for the active stocks. Now, one option we could have done is we could have copied these fields from the active stocks page as well, rather than we created them. Just setting up the conditional styling. Like we did before for this last deviation field, we will add the conditional display check for it. We'll put the server message on as well, just to be consistent. So we can now go to our bindings and start filling in all of these values. Okay, so put those changes in. Maybe a good point to run a full test of the application. Okay, so that's looking good. I obviously missed off the share price binding for that one, but otherwise we're looking good. Our coloring's coming through, percentage formatting, and our various tooltips, etc. So let's just go back and correct. Because you get a default bindings for these controls, which may work in simple cases, but when you're using custom data structures, etc., then you can just easily go in and correct those bindings to what we'd like them to be. Might want to put a slight gap between these tables here, but that's easy to sort out. So really the next the next step in terms of functionality of this application is how do I move stuff around? So I'm looking through these stocks that have got declared dividends. Oh, that one looks interesting. I want to watch that one. Put it in my list. Or actually, hey, I've bought that stock. Move it up into my active list. So let's start digging into that functionality, doing some database updates so that functionality gives us those capabilities that we want. So if we come back and look at our initial dashboard, and while I'm here, I'm just going to add a bit of spacing between the columns. Yeah. Okay, so we've got our structure of our application map here. We've got our main page, and we're pulling in these 3 separate partial pages, some of which are using our get stock status functionality. So in terms of adding from our right-hand side list to either of the lists on the left, we need to do some database functionality. We need to insert a record into one of those 2 tables. And then we need to refresh the lists so that we see the updated information, or potentially only refresh the list changed. So there's a number of different ways we could look at doing this, but what I'm going to do, I think, is I'm going to use more partial pages, use the controllers that are associated with those new partial pages to actually do the database updates and the database processing. And then once that happens successfully, we'll use our refresh functions that we set up earlier to load in the new lists. So that way, we're not having to refresh the whole page. We're just updating the bits that have changed. So I've got a new partial page over here. And let's say this is going to handle adding to either our watch or active list. So we'll call it add to watch or active. And the way we'll determine which we're going to do, which list we're adding it to, is we're going to create 2 actions from this, 2 actions are going to this page, different names. Now, when we add this new action, we've got a pop-up here, and it's saying, what do we want to do about this data source? Now, the data source that it's talking about is, if you remember earlier in the video, when we were setting up the initial SOAP-based web service call, we used the market field in the web service request. And at that point, we said we just wanted to submit it to the get declared stocks action of the 3 that we had defined. Now we're adding another action from that same page, and it's just asking us, do we want to use that data source that we added before for this action or not? Now, in this case, we don't. So I can untick that and carry on. And what I'm going to do is add a second action. Name will ask us again. We don't want it, so we can untick it. So we can name this. Let's say this is add stock to watch list. A second action that we'll call add stock to active list. So we will use the action name that we're calling to work out which list we need to add it to inside our controller. Okay, let's reload that. Now we've added these actions. And what we will also use this partial page for is we will get that page to render a message to say whether it was successful or whether there was an error or whatever. So we will output the display from this partial page on our main screen up in the top right corner, so we can see those messages. So if we look at the cell here, this is our top strip. We have our heading. So we are going to add there, and we're going to add a partial page container inside there. So we will So this is for our message partial pages. So we'll and in terms of layout on that cell, we want let's go over there. And in terms of that group, there we go. So we're saying our partial page will just be as big as its content, but I've just centered it in the container group that's filling the space left over after our heading text. Obviously, we can adjust this layout as needed. So we've got somewhere to show this message now. We need something to trigger these actions. So what we're talking about here is adding a stock to one of our lists. So we're going to add buttons to our right-hand side table to trigger each of these processes. So if we look at our declared stocks page, we've got a table here, and we can add buttons to the front. So if we say add to watch, okay. And in order to get those actions to be triggered when we click those buttons, we use the events. So when I click the add to watch button, I want to do an event that calls this new actions that we're setting up, add stock to watch list. I want to put the results in that group on the in my skin that I was just setting up, if you remember. Yeah. Now, because that group isn't on this partial page, I can't pick it from the list, but I can switch to enter the group name and just type it in there. So we're going to call that partial page and the controller processing link to that partial page. But how is it going to know what stock to add? So what I need to do before I make that call is to set the value somewhere. So again, I think you remember earlier we created this selected stock hidden field, and we said we were going to use that to keep track of particular stocks we're dealing with. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the value of that selected stock field to be the value of the epic code of the stock that we've clicked on. Because we're in a repeating structure, this will pick up the right value based on the row that we're interacting with. So we just need to make sure that that happens before we call our action. And then if we move on to the add to active button, in terms of those events, very similar. So we want to select our selected stock field from our epic. We want to do the AJAX submission, in this case, to our add stock to active list. And we want to put the resulting message that group. So in terms of the configuration onto this table, that's all we need to do. We've got our buttons there and we've hooked them up. So now we need to look at what rules we're going to perform on the server once these actions are triggered. So we can open up the rules for this new partial page. So in terms of what we need to do here, if they've requested to add it to the watch list, we want to insert an entry into that database table. If they've selected to add it to the active list, we want to insert an entry into the active database table. In terms of the information we're inserting, we can look back to our data model. Yeah, and we can see we need portfolio ID. We know we've got that flying around in our hidden field, so that's fine. The epic code for stock, we're just passing that in. We were okay there. The date, that's fine. So then we need to have the current share price of that stock. So at the moment, all we're getting into this controller is the code. We don't have its share price. So we're going to have to go and get that latest information to be able to add it. So one of the first things we actually need to do here is make use of our stock status processing that we've already created to get us the information so we can populate the current share price for this stock. So we can just pick that get stock status service. Now we should have all the information we need to be able to insert our database records. But one thing also we probably want to handle is what happens if they try and add it to the watch list when it's already in your active list, or vice versa. We probably want to make sure that each stock can only be in one of the lists at a time. So maybe even before we do this, we do some checking to say, does this stock already exist? And if so, let's stop there. So we can add some more rules. And to check that, we need to do a query against our database. So we can add a SQL statement action. We can pick the database that we want to talk to. And we can insert our SQL statements. Now, we can actually put multiple statements in here, as long as we separate them with the semicolon here. So we can do a select against both of these tables and see what we get. Now, as we said, the portfolio ID, we know it's coming from there, and our stock code is coming from there. Now, because this check is a separate piece of data, the response from it, we may not want to combine that directly with our incoming information. So this might be another case where you think it's useful to use a variable in our controller rules to separate our data fragments. Now it's telling me I haven't defined it yet, so I can quickly switch down to the bottom here and add it in. So this existing variable is going to contain the results of our check for an existing stock. So then we can add a rule to say it's an error if the stock is already watched. So we need a condition. When is this error? Well, let's check our DB response. If we go back and have a look in our documentation for the SQL statement, we can see the format of data we get back. For each statement, we'll get a block of information, which, if it's been able to retrieve some information, will have records within it. So if our first statement, so we put the 1 in the brackets there, has a record, then that means our first statement here matched something. So this is a problem. So that means it's already in our watched stock database table. And if that's the case, then we want to store an error message. I think we talked a bit before in our get stock status that if the error case is just going to return an error element that will end up under our data when we call it here. So we'll use the same thing and we'll assign a value to an error element under the data. So we can, when it comes to rendering a message to say whether this process was successful or not, we can look for this error message and output it accordingly. So let's say here stock is already being watched. And then we want to do exactly the same thing if it was active. So in that case, that's our second check, so our second SQL statement. And the stock is already active. So then when we come on to calling our service call to get the status, we can add a condition to say only do this if we don't have an error already. So we can see where our error information is, so we can make sure we don't have that. Okay, so we've checked we can do the operation we want to do. We've got the extra information we need, so now we can just do our database inserts. So let's just say this one is going to insert into the watch base. So it's going to be a SQL insert. Now what we need to check here is that the action they requested was the right one, because we only want to insert into the watch database if we had that incoming action. So we can say check the action, and we want to have our error check as well. So we'll copy that in. So we get, so as long as the action was right and we haven't got an error, then yeah, we can go in, we can do this insert. So here I need to put in our SQL. So we're inserting these values. So for the date, we're using current timestamp, and for the quantity for now, we're just setting those to 1 because we're not going to be using that field. So what we can see is that requires 3 values coming in. So we can take our portfolio ID. We know our selected stock. And based on the fact that our get stock status call returns us this stocks fragment that we've seen earlier, we know that binding, that XML check will work. But obviously we can check this once we've got a bit further along. We can test it, look at the debugger, bring that data back in, fine tune our XPath if they're not. And the share price is a numeric field, so we will change the type. Okay, now one thing in terms of the database inserts and updates in WebMaker is all of the operations that get performed within a controller. So within all of the rules, all of the database operations will take place within a transaction. So once all these controller rules are finished, if that data hasn't been committed, it will automatically be rolled back. Now, in this case, we're only ever going to do one database call. It will either be an insert into this database table or an insert into the active database table. So we can add the commit call as well straight away, because we're not worried about updating multiple tables and making sure that everything kept in sync. But if we didn't put the commit in there, we didn't have any commit calls, then our operation would get rolled back and we wouldn't see the change in the database. Okay, so let's just take a copy of that whole rule and insert into the active database. So we need to say, in this case, the action that we typed in before was add stock to active list. We can always switch back and confirm that on our application map if we need to. Our error check, that's all totally fine. But in terms of the database table, for the active table, date active as the field, price active as the fields. But in terms of our parameters to our SQL, that all stays the same. So then the final rule that we might want to add here is to check if we had any errors during the insert process. Now, if we go back to where we were looking at the response we're going to get from our SQL statements, we can see that we have a status flag here with an outcome that will either be success or fail if there was an error. So we can add a check for that and say, if I have a statement that the outcome wasn't successful, then we probably want to record that in this common error field that we're going to be using so that we don't lose that information. So as we did previously, we're going to assign to this data/error, but rather than typing in a string, what we'll do is we'll take the message from the SQL error, and that will be present in a message element underneath that status. Okay, so we've got all the rules that we should need there to add our records to our relevant database tables. So the final bit really for this add functionality is to get the partial page we created to output either a yes or no, it worked or it didn't message, and make sure we're refreshing the relevant list once it's completed. So if we go back, we look at our diagram here. This is the page we're dealing with. So what we can also add to our diagram, just for completeness here, is the link between here and our get stock status, because we have used that in our rules that we were just implementing. So just so our diagram is clear, we will add that link in. We can open up this partial page and add some messages. So really, we've got 2 success messages, and we've got the potential of a failure case as well. So I'll add 3 messages on here. So basically, we've got add watch success. So for these ones, let's just output a message here. Stock added. Or stock added to active list. And for the error situation, we want a dynamic value, which, as we know, is going to be this error field under the data. Now, in terms of the display of these messages, we want to pick which one to show based on what we've actually done. So we saw earlier we had visibility checks up here, Now, the other option for visibility that we have is under the more visibility options at the bottom, we can choose this remove option. Now, the difference is if we choose this option, this remove field based on server data, then the field is getting removed on the server and it's never making it to the client at all. Whereas if you use the more advanced visibility options up here, those settings are getting processed on the client. So depending on what configurations you set up, as field values change on screen as users type in different values, it will recheck visibility and adjust it. So as a result, if you use this options at the top here, all the fields will always end up on the client. They would just be hidden or visible based on the settings. So in this case, we can use the options down the bottom here to remove these messages, because we know we'll only ever be one of these that we want to show. And it's not something that's going to be changing on screen. So by asking that, it gives us the conditions of when do we remove this field. So there are two cases why we'd want to remove this first message. So one is if the action isn't add stock to watch list. And the other option is if we've got an error. So we can just put both of those in there. This one is exactly the same, but we want to remove it if the action isn't add stock to active list or if we've got an error. And then the last one, we only want to show this if we've got an error. So as long as there's not an error, remove it. Okay, so that sorts out our display of our messages. The final thing left to do, we were just talking about, is refreshing the list of stocks. So to do that, we're going to make use of onload events on our partial page. So when this message is displayed, when this page is displayed on our overall dashboard full page, we're going to call out to those refresh functions that we created earlier based on whether it was successful or not. So we'll open up our page events and we want to add an onload event. Now, the first thing we want to do is say, if there was an error, then we don't want to do anything. So the first condition, and we'll use a dynamic check. So that's a binding based check, and say, if we have an error field, then we want to stop. We don't want to do anything further. And we can go and fill that in now. So if there was an error, stop there. So if we carry on, we assume we've not got an error, so we want to go and do stuff. So we can use this call function and we can reference functions that we created earlier. So if you remember, we've set up refresh declared stocks, refresh active stocks, and refresh watched stocks. Okay, so we've got those calls, but we don't actually need to refresh both of those. We only want to refresh the one that we've added it to. So for completeness, we can add a condition to when we want to do these. Now we could use dynamic addition and put an XPath in, or we can use a value check condition and say, if the action is what's that, watch list. So we can say if add stocks to watch list is the action that was called, then refresh the watch list, and we can add a similar condition to this one. Action in. So in both cases, we're checking the action, but we're checking different values. Alternatively, we could have just done a dynamic condition and had action where dot equals, as we've seen elsewhere, different ways of doing the same functionality. But this is sometimes easy to read because you can see the values in place. So now we've configured everything that we need for this functionality, so we can use the test option again, and let's see and make sure it's all working properly. So we can see we've got our buttons appearing here. It's taking up a bit too much space, but we can adjust that. But say we click on here to add to our watch list. So we've got a message here coming out saying that the stock was added to the list, but we didn't get our table refreshing. So we'll try the other one and see. And we've got similar behavior. So it looks like the data's being processed, being added into the database, but the list isn't updating. So we can use our debugger call here. And we can see we've got two entries now into this add to watch or active controller, but we don't have any log showing that the list being refreshed. We can see our insert followed by our commit, and we can see that was all successful. So we need to look at the onload event and see why didn't it do the updates that we wanted. And we can look here and I can see straight away that our action names, copy them from here, add stock to watch list, add stock to active list, whereas we had an S in there that we don't need. So hopefully it's as simple as that. Let's test it and see. Okay, so we can see now we've loaded in this time, we've got those couple of extra entries from before, which is proving that the database transactions were working. So we'll just click through on another one here, and that time we can see it updated nicely. And likewise there, and the entries are appearing in our table. So that all looks like it's working correctly. So the main thing that we need to do for this functionality is just to sort out these buttons because they're taking up far too much space. We don't really want to have to be scrolling off to see all the info. So we can replace those with some icons. So if we go back to our declared stocks page. Now, if we wanted to add an icon in addition to the text, all of our controls, so buttons, text boxes, etc., support showing placeholder icons. So we can see we can easily enable that icon on either side, and we can change what image is displayed. But alternatively, if we wanted to just show an icon, which I think makes the most sense in this case, is we can use the font icon control. Now, if we merge that on top of our button, so hold the shift key, or you can manually trigger the merge option here, then we keep all our event settings that we already had, and we can just pick an icon. So for watching, we can use some kind of eye symbol there. here, and we will use some kind of plus sign maybe. Maybe we'll just go with that one for now. And what we can do now that we've lost the text, it's useful to add a tooltip message. So you know what the button's going to do. Okay, obviously looking much neater. Functionality wise, still got the same. That's a good check. Stock is already active, so we can't add it. It's fine. Pick a different one. Added it in. So we can see our sticky header functionality is working for these other tables as well. Now that we're starting to need the scroll. So that's good. So that functionality is working. Well, what we need now is, I want to delete them here. I don't want to watch it anymore. I've sold these shares. I don't need to track them anymore. So let's add some delete buttons to these tables. And then finally, we also need the ability to move something, or we want the ability to say, hey, I was watching this stock. It's looking good. I'm going to buy it. So move it up to my active list. So let's start putting in some of these extra functionality. And we'll do it in exactly the same ways for consistency. So we'll create a partial page that's going to output us our message. And before it outputs it, it's going to do the processing as well. And assuming that all goes okay, it's going to trigger a refresh of the relevant lists. Just close down some of my tabs here just to clean up. We can obviously easily reopen them if we need to. Okay. So let's add some more partial pages. This one is going to be delete from active. And we'll add another one that we'll call move to active. Changing the layout a bit here. Spend all day rearranging the diagram. If you ever need to use more space or whatever, you can zoom in and out here, move it around, and zoom it up there if you ever need to make use of a bigger diagram and more space for it. So we'll start adding some actions. As before, it's prompting us, do we need to use this request? Now in this application, that request is only useful for that one action. But case. So we'll just untick it on these prompts. And actually, we'll add two actions into this delete controller. As we've been doing before, because we're going to say delete from watch or delete from active. Yeah, so actually we need to go in and rename these actions. So move watched stock to active. And we'll have delete stock from watch list. And delete stock And then the final thing we want to put on here is in terms of this move watch to active. As we've seen just a few minutes ago when we were adding entries into the database table, is we need to know the current share price at that point. So we will need to make use of our get stock status again when we move the stock from the watch to the active list. So we'll just add this line to show that relationship. Okay, so we've added the bits on that we need, so we can now reload that. So if we look at the delete processing first, as we've done before, we will add in the rules and then configure the page display. So similar way, we're going to check our action. If it's a watch list, we're going to trigger the delete, which is database operation. So we'll use the SQL statement. We'll pick the database that we want to interact with. And we can enter our SQL statement. As before, we'll include the commit in the same set of SQL statements because we're only really doing one delete. If we were deleting from two different tables in two different rules, then we would separate the commit out to a separate stage so we can make sure both of the operations were successful first of all. And we will look at that in a minute when we come to moving between watch and active, because we want to add to active, delete from watch, but do all that as one transaction. So in terms of our values, we know portfolio ID and we know our stock is our selected stock, so we can just populate those nice and easily. Now for the delete from active, we want to do pretty much the same thing. So you just copy the rule. If you drag the rules with the control button clicked, it copies the same as on your page design. To drag controls, you can copy them with the control button clicked. Alternatively, you obviously have the right click options as well. So in this case, this is list. And we want to change that table name that we're deleting from. It's all fine. So the final thing we want to do is just have a check for any errors from those SQL operations. So what we can do is we put a rule in already there. So I'll just go and copy that. So if there was a SQL statement wasn't successful, take the message. So that should be all we need to do for our delete processing. So we need to just put the messages out on the screen now, like we've done before, and configure the events. And the error message needs to be dynamic. And we'll just be consistent. We'll use the same visibility option that we used for those other messages. We're looking for this error field under data. We want to remove our error message if we don't have one. Whereas for our success message, we only want to remove it if we do have an error. So in the final bit, like we did before, is our onload events. active stocks. So we're going to have a few different bindings. So the first one is our error field, and the second two checks are both against the action value that was requested. Okay, so we've got our processing there, we've got our response hopefully coming through. What we need to do is have a button to trigger it. So if we open up our active stocks page, we've decided we're going to use font icons. So I'll add one in to the end here. This is a delete button. You can see the icon there. We don't want that one. Let's put some kind of trash can. Okay, that looks good. We'll put tip. And as we've done a few times already, when we click on it, we're going to set the value of our selected stock field. We're going to get it from the epic value in our row, so that's fine. And then we're going to do our AJAX submission. So in this case, we are doing a delete from active list because we are on the active stocks page. And as we've done before, we're putting the message in to our message partial page container group on our skin. That's fine. And if I just copy that field and open up my watch stocks. Yeah, we just need to configure, make sure we're getting it from the right epic value, which is fine. And we want to delete from the watch list in this case. Okay, so now we've hopefully configured everything we need to for this delete functionality to work. So we can use our run test again, try it out, and hopefully it'll all work as expected. So we can see we've got our delete buttons here. So we'll try on our active stocks list. We've got the message here, and it's disappeared from the list. Likewise with our watched, if we try this AAL, and it's disappeared from the list. So that all seems to be working nicely. Okay, so carry on. The final thing we said about was moving something from this list up to this list here. So we've got our move watch to active partial page. We will use the controller rules to update the two databases or two database tables. And as we said a few minutes ago, we'll need the current status of the stock. So we can make use of the rule that we've already used elsewhere else, and put it into our new controller. So the first thing we'll do, get the status of the stock that we're moving so that we have the updated price information. So now we need to do an insert into the active table. We then want to do a delete from the watch table. And as long as both of them have been okay, we will do our commit processing. So we'll split it out over 3 rules so we can check each step. So let's do the insert first. Insert into active table. This one is going to be a delete from watch table. And our third rule here will do the commit if everything was okay. Yeah, so we'll use a SQL statement like we've done before. Pick the database we want to talk to. This is stock. And we can put in our relevant statement. So the values we need, we've done before, our portfolio ID, our Epic code, and we need the price, which is coming back from our service call here to get the status of that stock. So it's going to be under there. And we know, as we've done before, that it's in this stock format with the share price value. And like we did last time when we were inserting the price, we'll make that a float value because it does have decimal points in it. Okay. So then our second rule is also going to be a SQL statement. And this is going to be a delete. We need to select the record. And we need to do the same delete statement as we were just doing with our delete functionality. Because once we've added it into the active list, we want to remove it from the watch list. We've done all this before, so we can populate our bindings for our SQL params. So in terms of conditions, we probably want to make sure that the first one didn't fail. No point trying to delete it if our insert has already failed. We'll use the same check we've done before. So if a SQL result statement had a status that isn't a successful outcome, so as long as we don't have that, we can carry on. Likewise, our commit, as long as we don't have an error, we can carry on. And this becomes a very simple SQL statement. And again, we can pick our database. And we'll copy the rule that we've had before for checking for. So let's just say this is more generic. If there's a SQL error, then take the message into this error field as we've been using all along for display. So the other thing we want to make sure, it's probably worth having a condition here, is that we have got the status info okay from this first call. And we'll use that same check on our second call as well, because if we've not done the first one, we don't want to do the second one. Obviously, if that status call has failed, we'll have an error message already in our data, so that will get displayed, even though none of these other rules will fire. Okay, so I think that's completing the rules that we need there. If we open up this parcel page, we're going to output our messages in the same way as we've done a couple of times before now. So we'll add some text fields. Okay, and then finally our onload events. Similarly, so first of all, if there's an error, we want to stop processing, not do any further. But if not, then we, in this case, need to refresh both of the lists, the active list and the watch list. So we can just use two call function events. Go. That condition is saying if we've got an error, then stop. Okay, so that's our rules functionality. We've hopefully got our display messages, so we just need to add a button to trigger it, which in this case is going to be from our watch docs page. So we'll just add an icon in here. This one is going to be move to active button. And we'll use the same icon as we did on our right hand side table, which was this plus sign, to add it to the active list. Events on click. Coming from our edit field, that's right. Submission in this case is move watched stock to active. Submit all the data. And just copy the name of that group again. There we go. So again, we've put all the bits in place, so we can just test that and see if we've got it all right. So if we look at this EVR, hit the plus button, we can see both lists refreshed. It's no longer here, and it's appearing up there. So that looks like it's working nicely. So we now have the functionality working in terms of manipulating our lists and moving stocks from one to the other, etc., and seeing all of our deviations, our percentages, and all that information. So the final bit of functionality that we're going to put in that's useful when you're dealing about stocks and share prices and changes and stuff like that is to see some graphs of the history and how that price has changed over time. So if we go back to our list of our services and data sources that we're using, we have a final service, this get stock price history, that we haven't yet made use of. And this one, we pass it in the code and it gives us back history of share price and dividends for this stock. So we will use this service to provide this historic information and hopefully get some nice charts of the data. So to do this, we're going to add a link to each entry here, and we're going to use a pop-up dialog to show us the data. So if we go back to our dashboard and we look at our diagram, we're going to add another partial page. We're using lots of partial pages in this application today. and we'll call this stock history. And we'll add another link from here, get our pop-up as we've seen before. Stock history. Maybe we'll move it over here to fill in the gap so that if we shrink it down, we can still see relevant information. So in terms of the rules processing for this new partial page, it's going to be similar to some of the others. We're going to make a call to this new service, get the information. It's coming back in JSON format, so we're going to convert it into our XML format like we did before, and then we're going to render it by adding tables and etc. to this page. Now what we want to do is we want this information to appear in a pop-up dialog. So we'll also add the dialog control. So that will go on our main dashboard page here. So if we look in our containers, we have an entry here for a pop-up dialog. So we can just drag that onto our page. Now in terms of the structure, we have our containing group, which is our dialog. We have a placeholder for where our content is going to go. Now in this case, our content is actually going to be from a partial page. So we will put a partial page container into our dialog. And we can maybe rename that so that's our stock history partial page container. And then we have a button at the bottom by default on the dialog. We have a default caption of submit, but in this case, we just want to be able to close the dialog, I guess. So we'll change that. Yeah. So we've got our controls there. We've got our partial page, so we can maybe add the links to it. So we'll add an icon like we've done before to our active stocks in this case. Call this one history button. Maybe we have it's going to show us a chart so we can pick a nice icon for it. And events wise, we're going to do similar things to we've done a few times already now. Make sure we set our selected stock to the one we're interested in. And we're going to do the AJAX submission. We're going to get our stock history. And we're going to put it into the stock history partial page container that we've just been creating. So so far, that's all the same as we've done previously. So the one difference for this event is we also need to make our dialog pop up. So our dialog content is going to be loaded in because we've got our partial page call, but we want to make sure that that dialog is visible. So to do that, we use the toggle group visibility action. And again, the group isn't on this page, it's on the parent, so we can enter the name. And in terms of what name we'd like to enter, it is this container group here that we need to provide. That is the top level entry for our dialog. So by using that toggle visibility, it will know that that's a dialog control and it will show and hide our dialog. It's hidden initially, so when we click that, it'll make it visible. And if we want to, we can do that first. So then we see the loading message if this call was going to take some time. Okay, so we can save that change. And now we can look at the rules that we need in our new stock history controller. So as we said, we want to do similar things we've done before. So we need to create our request by inserting that HTTP header fragment and configuring it. We'll maybe want to make the call to the service. And we're likely to need to process the JSON response information and convert it into XML data that we can use. So as we've done before, we're going to insert our HTTP header fragment. This time, we're going to use this get stock price history URL, which we can see that here. And we're going to have still going to have a stock parameter. So we need to assign a stock value. In this case, it's just a single stock, so we don't have to worry about concatenating the CSV strings or anything. So we can just take our selected stock value and we can put it into a header fragment here. Now, we know this information is going to be under the data section. Here, because we don't yet have that namespace defined, we can see the XG maps to this Infinity XGate namespace. If we get these sort of errors, we need to make sure we define our namespace for our rules, or in terms of what prefix we're going to be using for that namespace in our XPaths. So we can add that in there and resolve that error. So we've created our request. Now in our second rule here, we want to call the service. In terms of the information we're sending, we're just doing a get request with the URL, so we just need to pass it our configuration fragment. In terms of our response, we can replace that fragment with whatever we get back. The service we're calling, we're going to use our REST proxy as we've done previously. So at this point, we need to now fill in the processing of our response message. But as we might not be totally sure exactly what format we're going to get that back, it's often easy to test it out and take the information from our debugger logs to help us construct the rest of the rules. So maybe at this point we will do a test and we will see what we're getting so far. Okay, so we've got our icon here. Okay, so we can click on it. We can see our dialogues come up. No content yet in it, but hopefully it has made call. We can see stock history. We've made a call, and yes, we've got some data back. So we can take that information into our rules and see what we're going to do to format it. So before we probably want to say we got to check we have content. As long as we've got some data, not empty, then we can format it. And exactly as we did last time, we'll use the Java method to XML. That fragment. We can save that. So one other thing from here we notice is that we want to probably give a better title for our dialog, and we can configure that on our dialog control. Some custom attributes here, and one of them is our title string. So if we just change that to say history, for example. Okay, yeah, titles come through, no content, but that's fine. If we look at the information here, we had it in JSON format, and then we can see we've got that information in XML format as well, which is useful for us for configuring our bindings. So if we switch back, we can open up page design for this, and we can start building out our page. So we know from our data source and whatever here that we're getting information back about the share price history and about dividend history. So we can maybe present both sets of information, and might be a good example to use some tabs to show that. So we can add a tab control on here, and we can give those some titles. So on this, so for the share price, we're going to show a table of the numbers, the data, and hopefully we'll get a chart next to it. So we use our paging table again, like we had previously. We can just drag one into our tab. And in this case, we'll look at the init fields. We will use the paging, and we will set a page size of 5 records at a time. So we're not taking up too much height on our dialog. So in terms of adding the fields to the table, we know what we want to show, because for each of these entries, we've got a date and we've got an amount. So we can put those headings in. And in terms of the bindings, we need to know where that data is and where the information is coming from. So the easiest way to do that is if we go back to our debugger and we use the update bindings link on here, like we've done before, and that takes this example data, or this real data that's got our other information in it, and we can pull that into our page design so we can easily populate the bindings. So again, we can turn on our option there to see our containers. We can easily pick out our repeating one. And we know in this case, we're talking about share prices. So we want to have a row in our table for every price in the history. And then this field is showing our date. So we can drag that in. And then the second field is going to be the value. So again, we can fill that in. So one thing we might want to do with the date is, like we've done before, make sure we're not showing the time part. Just keep it simple. Okay, so we can still preview our partial page. We can see we've got our records and we can page through them. Nothing on the dividend, so we can add another paging table exactly the same way to show the dividend information. In this case, we can see we've got 3 different things we want to show: declaration date, ex-dividend date, and amount. So we can add another field in there. We can maybe rename these so it's easier to see. to say for every dividend that we've got information for, declaration date, dividend date, amount. And if we want to, as we've done before, we could join the currency value with the amount on these fields. Let's just name these as well for consistency. So this is share price date. Okay. So we might want to restrict that second table to only show 5 records as well. Yeah, so we can see we've got our 2 tables. And depending on which one we click it through, we're getting different numbers. So to make it easy to visualize this, we want to put a chart of this data beside the table. So if we switch back to our page design, let's clear out some of these tabs that we're not using anymore. We can just remove these labels that we don't need there. So we have an example project you can download from the website that shows some various different charts. And we will try and use a similar approach to that project shows here to generate us a line graph for each set of data. Now, to generate the charts, we are going to use the Chartist library, the same as the example that we have on the website. So this is a script library that will generate you the charts from JSON information of the data to render. So the first thing we need to do is include the scripts and CSS that we need for this library. So on our Files tab, we can see our styling and our script files that we're using for this application. So in this case, we're looking at adding some information for this page, so we can upload the files that we need, both the CSS, and include it on our page, and the script file, and include that on our page. Right, so now we need to think about where our charts are going to be displayed. So in each tab, we've got a paging table at the moment. So what we'll also add is a container, the simple HTML container here, render the chart inside. So we can give this a name. Let's say this is the share price history chart. And we'll add the same here for our dividends. And in terms of layout, we will configure these tabs so that we get them side by side. Centralize it. Do the same tab. Okay, and then we can also give our chart container groups a size so we can actually have enough space for the chart to be readable. So for now, we'll just say, let's use 40% of the screen width. And we'll do the same for our other group. Okay, so in terms of actually now rendering the chart, we can use some script processing to initialize the chartist library, give it the data it needs. So in order to do that, we need to have the data available on the client side. So yes, we have the information in our table, which we could parse out, but to make things easier for us, we can use a data-bound control, data-bound structure here, which gives us a way of getting a whole fragment of information to the client that we can then access as either XML data or JSON data. So again, we can easily search our documentation. If you look at our JavaScript APIs section, scroll towards the bottom. Here we go. It tells us for our data-bound structure, this is how we access that information in our script. And we can use, in this case, what we will use is this get as JSON option to give us the data JSON format so we can then pass it on to the charting library. So what we'll do is we'll use two of these data-bound structures, one for each set of data. So rather than having one big structure and then we have to pull out the information, we'll just create two of them and bind each one to the relevant sets of our data. So I can drag that on. So we've got those on here. So if we call these names that we can remember, so this can be our share price history data, and we'll call this one history data. Now for each of these controls, if we go to our bindings, then we just have to point to it which structure of data are we interested in. So in this one, for the share price history, we want to take this fragment of data here, so the share price history, which will include all the price information that we have. And for the dividends, similarly, we'll take the dividend history. So that information is now available in our scripts to manipulate. So if we look at our files, by default, we have this placeholder script file because of the base project that we used to create this right at the start of the session today. So we can use this and we can put our functionality in here. So we create a function. So let's look at the share price chart. So the first thing we need to do is get our data out of our control. Now, you can see from the documentation that we have the function here to get access to our control. Use that, and if we go back again and just check the documentation, we see once we've got our data-bound control object, we can use this getAsJSON method on it. So we can just combine those two calls. So there we go, that's our share price data in a JSON format. Now the chart library needs our chart data to be in a format where we have a array of labels and then potentially multiple series of data. Now in this case, we've just got one series of data, which is our price history for this stock. So we can just map this data now into this object here. So save my typing, I can just paste in a fragment. So what we're saying is for the share price data, so you can see here, we want the share price history, and then underneath that, we're saying for every price element. Now for each one of these, we're taking the date and putting it into the label. Now, we know our date values here have a full date and time string, where we're only actually interested in part of that. In this case, because we've got lots of them, we're just going to show month and day. So we're just stripping out the relevant parts of that string. And then the value just goes into the first series directly. And now we can use this data to create a chart. So we can say our share price chart. Maybe we can define that up here in case we need to refer to it. So we want to create a line chart. Now the first thing we need to tell it is where it's going, and then we need to pass it our data. Now where it's going to go is inside this container that we've created, so we can just pass in the ID of that. So we want share price history chart. So when we call this function, it's going to get the data out of our data bound field here, convert it into the format that the chart library needs, and render us a line graph. So the only thing we need to do is trigger this function. So as we've done a few times already, we can add an onload event on our page and say, call this existing function we've just created in it. There it is, in its share price chart. So we should be able to now test that and see what happens. Okay, so we can see we've got the space now for our chart, but it's not actually rendered anything. Now we can check the console in our browser to find out the reasons, because we're getting script errors. In this case, it's saying that the field name here is undefined. So obviously I need to actually put in the name of the field to get the data from, which we created down here, share price history data. So I can just type that in so it knows where it's trying to get the data. So we can save that, back to our chart and refresh it. Hey, and there we can see we're getting a nice graph coming through. So then the final bit really we want to do is have an equivalent graph for our dividend information. Now in this case, the chart library needs the container where the chart's being rendered in to be visible in order for the chart to be drawn. So when this page loads in, this dividend section isn't visible yet because it's on a second tab. So in this case, rather than initializing this chart on load of the page, we will initialize it when we switch to the dividend tab. But other than that, we will use the same approach. So let's start with what we had here and see how we change it to say dividend chart. Okay, and what we will change, because we are going to be calling this from tab change. We don't want to be initializing it lots of times if they keep switching between the tabs. So we're only going to create it if we haven't done already. Switch back so we can see the names of these fields. We've got dividend history data as our data field. And we've got dividend history chart as our container. And now we can adjust the mappings here. On the dividend data, if we go back and look at our binding structure, we can see the format of that data. So rather than share price history, it's going to be dividend history is the root of our data structure. And rather than price, we have dividend. Now, in terms of the label, we're going to use the X dividend date. And the value here amount field in our dividend data. Okay, that hopefully enough changes here. What we'll also do is this is happening on load, so we will make sure our charts are both null before we start. Which is useful because we're in partial pages, so we're not necessarily refreshing all of the global script variables each time the page is loaded. Okay, so to trigger the loading or the initialization of our dividend chart, we're going to be looking at events in terms of tab switching. So we can click on our tab control field here, and we can look at the events that apply to it. So what we want to do here is on change. So every time I'm changing what tab is currently selected, we're going to do a check, and we're going to say if the tab control field, which we've got there, is set to dividends. So if I've just switched to the dividends tab, then I'm going to call my function. There it is there, unit dividend chart. So hopefully that should be enough to get both charts rendering. So we'll reload that. We can see a share price chart comes in, and we can switch there and see our dividend chart. So we can see we've got our links. Click on that one. So there's our share price chart. There's our dividend history chart. And we can see as we click through, we get a different plot based on stock we're clicking through. So I think the final thing we might want to do is let's add the button to do the same for our watch docs, which is very easy because we can just copy the field, paste it into here, and just make sure we're picking up the right epic value. All of the rest of this processing is consistent. So there we go. And we can also see a chart for our watch docs as well. Yeah, so we've completed the steps that we're hoping to get through in this video. I hope you've found it enjoyable and interesting. We've obviously shown a whole load of different bits of WebMaker, really, how we use data sources, databases, web services, REST services, and we've done a bit about a layout and styling of some of our tables, and a bit of work on partial pages, and a quick look at generating some charts there. So if you're interested, you can try out WebMaker for free on our website. Obviously, get in touch if you have any questions.
Awesome, Gerard. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed the session and will check out WebMaker in more detail. In this session, we focus primarily on WebMaker's enterprise features. You can find additional videos that focus more on the client-side layout and design features. There are also dedicated videos that demonstrate how to publish WebMaker applications to popular target hosting environments, including a one-click mechanism for publishing your apps to the WebMaker server at DigitalOcean. We will also be publishing another cool video shortly on WebMaker integration with Java server controllers. Hopefully you'll check these out. And if you have any questions, then please engage with us. You can connect with us via the usual social channels. You can also email us at support@highfinity.com or engage with us on our forum. Thank you for your time today, and see you again soon. Take care.